What kind of wedding begins with a bride who cannot speak, a groom who is waiting for her signature, and a whole town too frightened to tell the truth? In Mercy Crossing, Wyoming, Nora Whitaker thought she had come west to teach children and begin a quiet new life. But before she understood what was happening, she was dressed in white, led to an altar, and nearly forced into a marriage designed to steal everything her father left behind. Then the church doors burst open, and a wounded cowboy named Jack Calder rode in with blood on his face and proof in his hand. He was not there to claim her. He was there to give her back the one thing every human soul deserves: the right to say no. Welcome to our channel, where we tell emotional Western stories of cowboy courage, frontier love, motherly kindness, and the compassion that keeps people human in a hard world. This story reminds us that love is not control. Love is respect, freedom, and the courage to stand beside someone without owning them. If this kind of story touches your heart, please like, comment where you are watching from, share it with someone who loves Western romance, and subscribe for more heartfelt frontier tales.
Nora Whitaker did not remember putting on the wedding dress. She remembered the train whistle fading behind her the evening before, remembered stepping down onto the dry wooden platform of Mercy, crossing with one carpet bag, one letter of employment, and a heart foolish enough to believe the West might still have room for a woman who wanted to begin again. She remembered Mrs. Clara Finch from the general store, taking her by the elbow and saying the boarding house was full. But not to worry, dear. There was always a clean bed for a schoolteacher. She remembered tea in a blue china cup. Bitter tea. Too bitter. Clara had smiled when Nora made a face and told her Western water changed the taste of everything. After that, her memories came apart like thread pulled from a hem. Now she was standing inside a small white church with a veil over her face and a man's fingers locked around her wrist. The dress was wrong. That was the first thing her mind could hold on to. It was too loose at the shoulders and too tight around the ribs. The lace scratched her throat. The skirt smelled of cedar, dust, and old trunks. It belonged to some other woman, some other life, some other promise. Not hers. The church was full. Men in dark coats, women with gloved hands folded neatly in their laps. Children pressed against their mothers' sides. Every face seemed blurred around the edges, as though Nora were looking at them through rain. But there was no rain in Mercy Crossing, only dust, heat, and the hard white glare of morning through the windows. Beside her stood Caleb Rusk. Everyone in town seemed to know him. Nora had met him only the night before. He had introduced himself as a benefactor of the school, a ranch owner, a man interested in the education of young people. He had been handsome in the way wealthy men often were handsome, Clinshaven, well-fed, confident that every room would make space for him. Now his hand was around her wrist, not hard enough for the congregation to call it violence, hard enough that Nora knew she would bruise. Reverend Amos Bell stood before them with an open Bible. His voice trembled, but he kept reading. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today. Nora tried to move her fingers. They felt far away from her body. Her tongue was thick. Her head throbbed. Somewhere in the fog of her mind, one thought rose clear and bright. This is not why I came here. She had come for a teaching post. The letter was still in her carpet bag. Or perhaps it had been taken. It had promised a classroom, 22 pupils, wages paid monthly, and a small room behind the schoolhouse. She had read that letter so many times on the train that the creases had softened. She had believed every word. Caleb leaned closer, his mouth barely moving. Stand still, Nora. Her name in his voice made her stomach turn. The preacher reached the question too soon. Too fast, the words seemed to rush toward her before she could find a way to step aside. Do you, Nora Whitaker, take Caleb Rusk to be your lawful husband? The church became very quiet. Nora opened her mouth. No sound came out. Panic rose in her chest, but even panic felt trapped behind the drug still weighing down her blood. She tried again. Her lips moved. Her throat burned. Nothing. Caleb's thumb pressed into the inside of her wrist. Just nod, sweetheart, he whispered. It'll all be easier once you stop fighting. That was when the doors of the church burst open. The sound cracked through the room like a rifle shot. Everyone turned. A man stood in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame as though it was the only thing keeping him upright. His hat was gone. His dark hair was wet with sweat and dust. Blood ran from a cut at his temple and down the side of his face. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. One sleeve hung loose where the seam had ripped. Nora did not know him. But every person in that church did. A woman gasped. Someone muttered a curse. Caleb's hand tightened so sharply, Nora nearly cried out. The man stepped inside. He was not polished. He was not clean. He did not look like a hero riding in from some dime novel with silver spurs and a shining smile. He looked like a man who had been beaten, thrown down, and still decided the road was not finished with him. "Stop the wedding," he said. His voice was rough, but it carried. Reverend Bell went pale. "Mr. Calder," the man lifted a folded paper in his bloodied hand. Her signature was forged. The silence changed. It was no longer churchyard silence. Caleb laughed softly. "Jack Calder, I should have known. Jack Calder." Nora tried to place the name, but her mind offered not. Caleb turned toward the congregation. His smile said in impatience, speaking to children, "You'll forgive this interruption. Mr. Calder has had troubles of the mind and bottle both. Most of you know that." Jack did not look at the congregation. He looked at Nora, not at the dress. Not at the veil, at her face beneath it. "Can you answer for yourself, Miss Whiteacre?" Nora tried. Her breath shook. Caleb spoke before she could. "She is unwell, overcome with nerves. The doctor has already said." "The doctor never saw her," Jack said. Doc Harlan Pike, seated near the third pew, slowly looked up. Caleb's smile thinned. Jack unfolded the paper. This was drawn up before the ceremony. Transfer of land and water rights from Nora Whiteacre to her lawful husband, Caleb Rusk, to be signed after the vows. A low sound moved through the church. Nora heard the words, but at first they would not settle into meaning land, water rights, lawful husband. Then, piece by piece, they locked together. Silver Spring, her father's land, her inheritance, the thing her Uncle Horace had always told her was worthless, western dirt. She turned her head toward Caleb. His face had changed, the softness was gone. "You brought me here for that," she whispered. His mouth barely moved. "You should be grateful. Most women get less." Jack took another step forward. One of Caleb's men rose from the front pew, a broad man with a red beard and a pistol at his hip. "That's far enough, Calder." Jack kept walking. The man struck him with the butt of his gun. Nora saw the blow land against Jack's ribs. He dropped to one knee, breath leaving him in a hard grunt. A few women cried out. No one moved to help. Caleb pulled Nora back toward the altar. "Finish it," he snapped at the preacher. Reverend Bell's hands shook around the Bible. Nora looked at him. She looked at the congregation. So many eyes, so many people seeing, so many people deciding not to see. Then she looked at Jack Calder. He was pushing himself upright, one hand pressed to his side, blood dripping from his chin onto the church floor. He was hurt. He was outnumbered. He had no reason to risk his life for her, except that what was happening was wrong. Something inside Nora, something drugged but not dead, rose to meet that truth. The preacher swallowed. "Do you, Nora Whiteacre?" "No." The word came out small, but it came out. The whole church heard it. Caleb turned on her. "Nora." "No," she said again, louder this time. Then Maisie Bell, the preacher's daughter, stood in the second pew. She was only 15, thin as a reed, her face white with terror. She said, "No," Maisie said, "I heard her." Doc Pike stood next. Then Silas Boone, the old veteran with the silver beard, rose slowly at the back of the church. That was enough, not justice, not yet, but enough of a crack in the wall. Jack reached Nora first. He did not grab her. He held out his hand. "You can walk," he said. "If you choose." Those 3 words nearly broke her. "If you choose." Nora placed her hand in his. They ran down the aisle while Caleb shouted behind them. Outside, the sunlight struck Nora like a slap. Jack lifted her onto his horse, then swung up behind her with a sound of pain he could not hide. A gun fired as they tore away from the church. Then another. Jack's body jerked. His arm tightened around her for one sharp second, and Nora felt warm blood touch the sleeve of the borrowed wedding dress. "You re-hit," she said. "Not enough," Jack muttered, and drove the horse harder. They rode until the town disappeared behind dust and distance. Only when they reached a small cabin at the edge of a dry creek bed did Jack finally slow. He helped her down, though he nearly fell doing it. Inside, the cabin smelled of leather, smoke, and loneliness. Nora stood by the cold stove, still wearing the veil. Jack sat in a wooden chair and tried to peel his shirt away from the wound in his shoulder. His hands were not steady. "I stopped the wedding," he said. "That doesn't mean you re-safe." Nora looked down at the white dress, at the dirt along the hem, at the blood darkening one sleeve. Then she looked at the man who had ridden bleeding into a church so she could say one word. "No," she said quietly. "It means, now they will come for both of us." Morning came without mercy. It slipped through the cracks of Jack Calder's cabin in thin yellow lines. touching the rough plank floor, the cold stove, the rifle above the door, and finally the torn white wedding dress draped over the back of a chair like something dead. Nora Whitaker woke to the sight of it and for one terrible second believed she was still in the church. Her heart slammed hard enough to hurt. She sat upright on the narrow cot, one hand flying to her throat, expecting lace, a veil, Caleb Rusk's fingers around her wrist. But there was no veil, no preacher, no congregation pretending not to see. Only the cabin, the smell of smoke, and Jack Calder sitting at the table with his shirt open at the shoulder, a strip of bandage, dark with blood. He had not slept. Nora could tell by the gray look beneath his eyes and the way his jaw tightened every time he moved his left arm. A tin cup of coffee sat untouched beside him. On the table lay the folded paper he had carried into the church, smoothed flat now beneath the weight of a hunting knife. The sight of it made Nora's stomach turn. Yesterday that paper had been only a shape in his bloodied hand. This morning, in the clear light, it looked more dangerous than any gun. Jack looked up when she moved. "You steady enough to stand?" Nora swallowed. Her mouth still tasted bitter, as if the tea had soaked into her bones. "I think so. Thinking and doing are two different things." There was no softness in the words, but there was no cruelty either. He spoke like a man measuring weather before riding into it. Nora swung her feet to the floor. The room tilted once, then settled. She held the edge of the cot until her fingers stopped shaking. Jack watched, but he did not come to help her. She was grateful for that. After what Caleb had done, after being dressed, guided, handled, and nearly married while half-conscious, Nora needed one small thing to belong to herself, even standing. "I can stand," she said. Jack nodded. "Good." Outside, a horse snorted. The wind pushed dust against the cabin walls. Nora noticed then that the door was barred from the inside with a heavy plank. A chair had been set beneath the back window. Jack's revolver lay within reach of his right hand. "They re-watching the road," he said, as if answering the question she had not asked. Nora turned toward him. "Caleb meant too at the South Trail. Maybe more near the creek crossing. They weren't trying hard to hide. You went out before dawn. You were shot yesterday. Gray's that bandage says otherwise." He glanced at his shoulder as though it belonged to somebody else. "A bullet through meat ain't it the same as a bullet through bone?" Nora stared at him. "Is that meant to be comforting?" "No, just accurate," for reasons she could not explain. That almost made her laugh. Not because anything was funny. Nothing was. But after a day of lies dressed up in church words, accuracy felt like a kindness. Jack reached for the paper and turned it toward her. "You need to see this." Nora crossed the room slowly. Her legs felt weak, but anger kept them moving. She sat across from him, careful not to touch the wedding dress hanging on the chair beside her. Jack pushed the document closer. The handwriting was formal and neat. The words were worse. Nora read the first line twice before her mind accepted it. "Transfer of management and authority over Western land, spring rights, grazing access, and inherited water claims belonging to Nora Ellen Whitaker upon lawful marriage, to her husband Caleb Rusk." Her breath caught. Jack said nothing. Nora kept reading. Each sentence was a new lock on a door she had not known was closing. The document stated that upon marriage, her husband would act as legal manager of all Western assets. It stated that she willingly recognized his authority over disputes, sales, leases, improvements, and water usage. It stated that her signature below would confirm her full understanding. Below the language sat a blank line. Nora Whitaker Rusk. She stared at the space where they had expected her to write a name that was not hers. "They meant for me to sign this after the ceremony," she said. Jack's eyes stayed on her face. "Most likely before you were clear-headed, they drugged me." "Yes," the word fell between them, plain and heavy. Nora pressed her hand flat on the table. "Mrs. Finch gave me tea." Jack's expression shifted just slightly. "Clara?" "She said the boarding house was full. She said she had a spare room. She said Western water changed the taste of everything." Nora closed her eyes and the memory came back in pieces. Clara's warm kitchen, the blue cup, the woman's nervous smile, a hand on Nora's shoulder when she tried to rise. "I remember trying to stand. I remember saying I needed to check my carpet bag. Then nothing until the church." Jack leaned back. The chair creaked beneath him. "Clara Finch owes the bank nearly everything she has." Nora opened her eyes. "That explains it." "No." His answer came fast. "It may tell why she bent. Does make bending right that steadied her more than sympathy would have." She looked down again at the document. "Silver Spring, that is what this is about." Jack nodded once. "My father bought that land years ago. My uncle told me it was worthless. Dry acreage," he said. "A foolish investment from a man who trusted maps more than men. Your father trusted the right map." Nora looked up. Jack reached for a second paper. This one older and folded at the corners. This was tucked behind the transfer. Maybe Caleb wanted proof of what he was taking. It was a copy of a land claim. Nora recognized her father's name, Thomas Whitaker. The sight of it hurt in a place she had not guarded. Her father's hand had once guided hers across a school slate. He had smelled of ink, tobacco, and winter wool. He had told her numbers did not lie, but men sometimes did when numbers stood in their way. Jack tapped the edge of the paper. Silver Spring sits about 12 miles northwest of town. Does look like much if you don't know where to dig, but it feeds 3 grazing routes underground. In a dry year, cattle live or die by that water, and Caleb wants it. Caleb wants more than water. He wants every small rancher in Mercy Crossing coming to him with a hat in hand. If he controls the spring, he controls who grazes, who sells, who starves out, and who keeps land long enough to pass it their children. Nora felt cold despite the morning heat, and marriage would have made it legal. Respectable, Jack said. The word was bitter in his mouth. Nora looked toward the wedding dress. Yesterday, that dress had been a prison. This morning it looked like evidence. They built a wedding around a theft, she said. Jack's gaze darkened. They dressed theft in white and called it holy. For a while neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind moved over the dry grass with a sound like whispering skirts. Nora wondered how many people in that church had known. Reverend Bell had looked frightened. Clara had looked guilty. Caleb's men had looked ready. The congregation had looked away. Was that knowledge? Was fear a confirmation? Nora did not know. She only knew that if Jack had not come through those doors, she might have woken this morning as Mrs. Caleb Rusk, with her name altered, her property stolen, and half the town willing to call it Goddess will. She folded her hands tightly in her lap. You said the road is watched. It is. Then we cannot go to Laramie. Not today. And if we stay here, they'll come. She expected fear to rise again, but something else came first. A clean, hard anger let them. Jack studied her. That's a brave thing to say inside 4 walls. I was nearly married in front of a room full of witnesses while I could barely speak. I do not feel kindly toward caution this morning. A corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. Caution keeps people breathing. So does justice, not as often as it should. The answer was so tired that Nora looked at him more closely. Jack Calder was younger than she had first thought in the church, 34 perhaps. But there was a heaviness around him that belonged to older men. Men who had learned not to expect the world to correct itself. The cut at his temple had dried dark. His left cheek was bruised. Beneath the open shirt, the bandage at his shoulder was clumsy and already soaked through. You need a doctor, she said. He looked away. Doc Pike would come if he could. Caleb will have men watching him too. I can change the bandage. No, I know how to clean a wound. No, you would rather bleed through your shirt out of pride. He gave her a flat look. I'd rather not faint in front of a woman I just pulled out of a church that time. You did laugh. It was small and cracked but real. Jack seemed surprised by it. Perhaps she was too. I have seen worse than blood, Mr. Calder, Jack. The correction was quiet. Nora paused. He reached for the coffee cup and finally took a drink, though it must have been cold. If Caleb is coming after both of us, you must well, Jack. Nora, she said. No, not Miss Whitaker. Not Mrs. Anything. Nora's eyes held hers for a moment. Nora, then the sound of her name, spoken without ownership, did something strange to her chest. She looked away before he could see too much. A knock came at the door, not loud, not frantic. 3 measured strikes. Jack moved faster than Nora expected. In one motion he had the revolver in his hand and was standing beside the wall, out of line with the door. Pain drained the color from his face, but he did not make a sound. Who is it? He called. No answer. Another knock, then the scrape of paper sliding beneath the door. Jack waited. Nora held her breath. Outside, a horse shifted, then hooves moved away across the hard ground. Only when the sound faded did Jack lower the gun. He picked up the paper. Nora watched his face as he read it. Whatever was written there did not surprise him, but it settled over him like weather turning bad. What does it say? She asked. Jack handed it to her. The message was short. Return Miss Whitaker before sundown. Admit your interference was a misunderstanding born of drink and confusion. Do this, and Mr. Rusk may show mercy. Refuse, and you will be charged with kidnapping, assault, and theft of a lawful bride. Miss Whitaker will be placed under proper care until her mind is judged sound. Nora read the last line 3 times. Proper care. Her fingers tightened around the paper until it crumpled. They mean to say I am insane. They mean to say whatever gives them power. They cannot simply decide that. Jack's silence answered before his words did. In this territory, with the right judge, the right banker, the right preacher too scared to object, he took the note back and tossed it onto the table. They can try. Nora stood. The room swayed again, but she refused to sit. Then we gather proof. Jack looked at her. You need rest. I need my carpet bag. My letter. My father's records if they have not taken them. I need to know who signed that false document. I need Mrs. Finch to say what she put in my tea. Clara may not talk, then we find someone who will. Jack looked toward the door, then at the barred window, then back to Nora. You understand what happens if we go back into town. Yes, Caleb will call you confused. Let him call me a criminal. You said the town already does. Something flickered in Jack's face. Not anger, not quite pain, something older than both. Nora softened, but only a little. I am sorry, that was cruel. It was true. Truth can still be cruel. He seemed to consider that as if it were a lesson he had never been offered. Then he walked to the shelf near the stove and took down a small wooden box. Inside were cartridges, a few coins, a coil of wire, and a brass key. What is that? Nora asked. Key to the schoolhouse. You have it? Used to repair the roof before the last teacher left. Nobody asked for it back. Nora stepped closer. If the schoolhouse is real, why lie to bring me here? Because the position was real enough to bait the hook. That's how men like Voss work. A lie holds better when half of it is true. The sentence chilled her because she knew it was right. She had believed the letter because some part of it had been believable. A schoolhouse, children waiting, a town in need, a woman wanting a life of her own. Jack, let's put the key. We go near dusk, less eyes. We check the schoolhouse first, then the church, if we can get in my carpet bag. Where was it last? Clara Finch, spare room. He nodded. Then we'll need. Clara. Nora looked at the note on the table. Caleb had given them until sundown. He expected fear to do most of his work for him. Perhaps it always had. She crossed to the chair and lifted the wedding dress. For a moment her hands trembled as the fabric unfolded. It was stained now with dust and Jack's blood. The hem was torn from the ride. A dress meant to trap her had become a record of her escape. What are you doing? Jack asked. Nora found the pocket sewn into the skirt. Empty now. She tore it open at the seam anyway. Jack watched her. If they hid one paper in this dress, she said, I want to know whether they hid another. A small piece of folded card fell to the floor. Neither of them moved for half a second. Then Jack bent carefully and picked it up. He opened it, read it, and his jaw tightened. Nora took it from him. It was a list, not long. 4 names: Reverend Amos Bell, Clara, Caleb Rusk. Side each name was a time. Beside Clara's name were 2 words. Tea prepared. Nora felt the room go still around her. Jack said softly, Now we know which is Caleb. Nora closed her fist around the card. No, she said. Now we know where to begin. By late afternoon, the sun had flattened itself against the western hills, throwing long shadows across Jack Call's cabin and turning the dry grass the color of old brass. Nora Whittaker stood near the small cracked mirror, nailed beside the door, fastening the last button on a plain brown dress that did not belong to her. The dress had come from a cedar trunk at the foot of Jack's cot, folded under quilts and old winter shirts. It was faded at the sleeves, too short at the wrists, and mended twice along the hem, but it was clean. More than that, it was not white, it was not lace, it was not the dress they had put on her while she could barely stand. Nora had cut the wedding gown apart that morning with Jack's hunting knife, not in rage, not exactly, but with a steady care that made Jack keep silent. She had saved the stained sleeve and the torn pocket with the hidden list inside. The rest she folded and wrapped in cloth, because evidence, she had learned, could look like almost anything. Jack watched her from the table while pretending not to. His shoulder had been re-wrapped, though he had complained through most of it, and his face had gone gray when Nora pulled the old bandage free. He had not fainted. That seemed to please him more than it should have. Now he wore a dark coat over his wounded side and kept his revolver low at his belt. He looked tired, hard, and half ready for a fight he did not want. We don't stay long, he said. Nora turned from the mirror. We go to the schoolhouse first. We go to the schoolhouse if the street is clear of his store. Then the church if Bell has locked it and if Caleb is waiting. Jack picked up his hat. Caleb is always waiting. Men like him don't chase unless they have to. They arrange the roads so you walk into them. Nora took that in. She had known men like Caleb in drawing rooms and dining rooms back in St. Louis, men who never raised their voices because the world had already been taught to listen. Out here the coats were dustier, the streets rougher, but power had the same posture everywhere. It leaned back, it smiled, it expected obedience. They rode toward Mercy Crossing as the light began to thin. Nora sat behind Jack on his horse, one hand holding the back of his coat, careful not to touch the wound in his shoulder. Neither of them spoke much. The land rolled wide and dry around them, broken by sagebrush fence posts and the occasional dark shape of cattle against the horizon. In another life, Nora might have found it beautiful. In this one, every rise of ground looked like a place where a man with a rifle might wait. The town came into view just as the church bell rang 6 times. Mercy Crossing was smaller than Nora remembered, though perhaps terror had made it larger in her mind. One main street, a general store, a blacksmith shop, a bank with clean glass windows, a saloon with its doors open and music leaking out in tired notes. At the far end stood the white church, its steeple sharp against the evening sky. People noticed them before they reached the first hitching rail. A man outside the blacksmith shop stopped hammering. 2 women on the boardwalk paused with baskets on their arms. A boy carrying firewood stared until his mother pulled him behind her skirt. No one called out. No one came forward. The whole town seemed to draw one long breath and hold it. Nora kept her chin lifted. Jack dismounted first, then offered his right hand to help her down. She hesitated only a second before taking it. His hand was rough and warm. He let go as soon as her boots touched the dirt. That small courtesy steadied her. The schoolhouse stood behind the church, a narrow building with peeling paint and one cracked window. Jack unlocked the door with the brass key he had kept from repairing the roof months earlier. Inside, the room smelled of chalk, dust, and disuse. Desks sat in uneven rows. A slate board covered one wall. On the teacher's desk lay a stack of old primers and a dried ink bottle. Nora walked slowly to the desk. For a moment, grief caught her off guard. This was real. The schoolhouse was real. The children were probably real too. That was the cruelest part of the lie. Caleb and Voss had not invented a dream from nothing. They had taken something Nora wanted and turned it into bait. Jack opened the desk drawer. Anything? Nora found a ledger with the names of pupils written inside, but no mention of her employment, no contract, no board approval, no wages recorded. She searched the lower drawer and found a torn envelope addressed to Miss Nora Whitacres, Lewis, Missouri, but the letter itself was gone. "This proves they knew I was coming," she said. "It proves someone here received your answer." She folded the envelope and slipped it into her pocket. "Then someone here can say who." Voice spoke from the doorway. "You shouldn't be here," Nora turned. Reverend Amos Bell stood outside the schoolhouse, his hat in both hands. He looked older than he had in the church, smaller somehow. Without the Bible in front of him, without the pulpit to hold him up, he was just a frightened old man with tired eyes. Jack moved slightly between him and Nora, the preacher noticed. Shame crossed his face. "I didn't come to stop you. Then why did you come?" Nora asked. Bell swallowed. "To tell you to leave town before this gets worse." Nora stared at him. Worse than being drugged and dragged to an altar. His mouth trembled. "Miss Whittaker, do not call me that, as if respectability can cover what you help do." The words landed hard. Jack glanced at her, but he did not interrupt. Bell looked down at his hat. "I was told you had agreed. I was told you were nervous." Mr. Russ said your family approved, and when I could not answer for myself, he closed his eyes. I was afraid the honesty did not soften as much as he might have hoped of Caleb. Of Voss, of what they can do to a man who stands alone. Nora stepped closer. "Then you understand something, Reverend. Yesterday I stood alone in your church, and you keep reading." Bell's face crumpled. But before he could reply, another voice cut across the street. "Well now, isn't this a touching little gathering?" Caleb Rusk stood near the hitching rail in front of the bank, dressed in a dark coat and a silver-gray vest. Elias Voss stood beside him, thin and pale, his hands folded over the head of his cane. Caleb looked at Nora as though she were a horse that had slipped its lead. "Irritating but recoverable, Nora," Caleb said gently. "You've had quite a day. No one blames you for being confused." Jack's jaw tightened. Nora walked out of the schoolhouse before Jack could stop her. The street had filled without seeming to. Men stood outside the saloon. Women watched from porches. Clara Finch appeared in the doorway of the general store, one hand pressed against her mouth. "I'm not confused," Nora said. Caleb smiled sadly at the crowd. "You hear how agitated she is," I said. "No, in the church you were overwrought. I was drugged." A murmur moved through the watching faces. Voss lifted his chin. "That is a serious accusation, Miss Whittaker. A lady ought to be careful before damaging her own reputation with wild claims." Nora looked at him. "My reputation was not your concern when you forged papers in my name." Voss did not flinch, but his eyes hardened. Caleb took a step forward. "Jack Calder has filled your head with lies. This man is known in Mercy Crossing. Ask anyone here what his word is worth." No one spoke. That silence told Nora more than any answer could have. Caleb turned slightly, including the town in his performance. "Mr. Calder is a violent man with a tragic history. He lost his brother in a fire of his own making, and instead of seeking repentance now seeks to ruin a lawful marriage. Jack's face went still too still. Nora felt the change in him like a drop in temperature. She did not know the full story yet, but she knew enough. Caleb had not said those words to defend himself. He had said them to put Jack back in a cage the town had built years ago. Nora stepped forward until she stood beside Jack, not behind him. "A lawful marriage requires a willing bride," she said. "A bride walks by choice," was carried. For a moment, even the wind seemed to stop. Then, from the edge of the crowd, Maisie Bell slipped between two women and hurried toward Nora. The girl's face was pale, but her eyes were determined. She pressed a folded scrap of paper into Nora's hand. "I saw them," Maisie whispered, "before the wedding in the back room." Her father made a broken sound. Maisie but the girl stepped back into the crowd before anyone could grab her. Nora unfolded the paper. 4 names. Caleb Rusk. Elas Voss Clara Finch. One of Caleb's riders. Beside them were times. Beside Clara's name were 2 words that made Nora's stomach twist. "Tea prepared." Nora looked across the street. Clara Finch stood in the doorway of the general store, tears shining on her face. She shook her head once, not in denial, but in pleading. Nora saw fear there. Real fear. A woman afraid of losing her store, her home, her place in the town. A woman who had told herself she had no choice while handing another woman a poisoned cup. Caleb's smile vanished. "That child is making trouble," he said. "No," Nora replied, folding the paper carefully. "She is telling the truth." Voss tapped his cane once against the boardwalk. "You would be wise to return what does not belong to you, Mr. Calder." Jack's voice came low. "She does belong to anyone." The words moved through the crowd like something dangerous. Nora turned to leave before Caleb could twist the moment. Jack followed. No one stopped them, not because the town was brave yet, it was not, but doubt had entered the street, and doubt could slow even powerful men. They rode out as dusk settled purple over Mercy Crossing. For a long while Nora said nothing. The scrap of paper rested inside her pocket like a coal. Finally Jack spoke. "People here don't always do wrong because they hate you. Sometimes they do it because they're afraid of losing what little they have." Nora watched the town shrink behind them. "That may explain it," she said. "It doesn't excuse it." Jack nodded once as if the words had weight, and he accepted them. Ahead, his cabin waited in the dark. Behind them, Mercy Crossing had begun to whisper, and for the first time since Nora arrived, the whispers did not all belong to Caleb Rusk. The storm came before they reached the cabin. It did not arrive with thunder or rain, the way storms did back east. It came as a wall of dust rolling low across the open ground, swallowing the last light of evening and turning the world the color of rust. Jack saw it first. His body stiffened in the saddle, and Zora felt the change through the back of his coat before he spoke. "Hold tight." She did not ask why. The answer was already moving toward them. The wind struck hard enough to make the horse stumble. Dust filled Nora's mouth and eyes. She gripped Jack's coat with both hands, careful of his wounded shoulder, though the horse's sudden lurch nearly threw her sideways. Jack leaned low, one arm working the reins, his injured side pressed tight, as if pain were just another thing to be managed until there was time for it later. By the time they reached the cabin, the sky had disappeared. The barn doors slammed open and shut in the wind, banging so violently the sound seemed to come from inside Nora's own ribs. The Saint inside screamed and kicked against the boards. Jack slid down from the saddle and nearly went to one knee. He caught himself on the stirrup, jaw clenched, face pale beneath the dust and dried blood. "Get inside," he said. Nora dropped down after him. "No," he turned, eyes narrowed against the blowing dirt. "This ain't a discussion, it is, if you expect me to sit by the stove while the barn tears apart." A gust hit them, stealing whatever answer he might have given. Jack looked toward the barn, then back at her, measuring not her strength but her stubbornness. At last he shoved a lantern into her hands. "Keep that covered. If it goes out, stay where you are until I find you." They fought their way across the yard together. The wind dragged at Nora's skirt and filled every fold with dust. She held the lantern beneath her shawl, one hand cupped around the glass. Jack reached the barn first and threw his weight against one swinging door. Nora helped with the other, using both arms and one shoulder, grunting as the wood bucked under her palms like a live thing. Inside, the horses were wild with fear. One kicked the stall wall hard enough to splinter a board. Jack moved toward it without hesitation. "Easy," he said, his voice low but firm. "Easy now." Nora stood in the doorway, holding the lantern high. The light trembled over Jack's face as he reached for the frightened animal. She expected the horse to pull away. Instead, after a long moment, it lowered its head by inches. Jack touched its neck with his good hand, slow and steady. For the first time, Nora saw what his hands were capable of besides violence and survival. He worked through the storm as if pain had no claim on him. He tied a broken latch with rope, braced a loose board with an old fence rail, and showed Nora where to hold the lantern while he wedged the door shut. Twice she saw blood spread beneath his coat. Twice he ignored it. When the worst of the wind passed, they were both coated in dust from hair to boots. Nora's hands shook from effort. Jack's face had gone ashen. "You re-bleeding again," she said. He leaned against the barn wall, breathing through his teeth. "Noticed you are the most aggravating man I have ever met. That list must be short. It is growing." Something almost like amusement crossed his face, then vanished when he tried to straighten. Outside, the storm had left the yard dim and strange, the air thick with dust hanging in the last of the light. The cabin stood cold and dark. The smokehouse, however, still held heat from the banked coals. Jack had left there that morning. He nodded toward it. "We sit there a spell. Cabin'll be colder than charity." The smokehouse was small, low-roofed, and warm enough to make Nora suddenly aware of how badly she was trembling. Strips of cured meat hung from beams overhead. The air smelled of hickory smoke, salt, and old wood. Jack lowered himself onto an upturned crate with care. He tried to hide and failed. Nora set the lantern on a barrel. For a while neither of them spoke. The quiet after the storm felt large. Outside, the wind still muttered along the walls, but inside the smokehouse, the world had shrunk to amber light, smoke, and two people too tired to pretend they were unaffected by the day. Nora looked at his shoulder. "I should clean that again. You already did once, and you ruined my work. I'll try to bleed neater next time." She gave him a look. He sighed and began unbuttoning his coat with his right hand. It took too long. Nora stepped forward, and this time he did not refuse when she helped ease the coat off. The bandage beneath was dark. As she worked, she felt him watching the floor instead of her face. "You came to the church because of Maisie," she said. He said nothing, but that is not all of it. His eyes lifted. Nora kept her hands steady on the cloth. "You look like a man walking into a place he had already died once." The words hung between them. Jack looked away toward the smoke-dark beams. For a long time, Nora thought he would not answer. Then he spoke so quietly she almost missed the first words. "My brother's name was Daniel." She stilled. "He was younger by 6 years, faster than me at cards, worse than me with horses, better than me at making people forgive him." Jack's mouth tightened. He could talk himself out of trouble right up until the trouble got bigger than his mouth. Nora rinsed the cloth in a small basin of water. The water turned pink. "He owed money," Jack continued, "to men he should have played against. Caleb was one of them back then. Caleb liked to pretend he was just another rancher with a lucky hand and a fine coat. Daniel thought he could win back what he lost. What happened? There was a fight, Daniel and me. I told him to leave Caleb's place alone. He told me I was tired of being his brother and wanted to be his keeper." Jack's jaw worked once. Last words I'd said to him were ugly. Nora did not move. That night, the barn caught fire. I saw the smoke from the ridge. By the time I got there, half the roof was burning. Someone said Daniel was inside. I heard him. Jack's voice changed on those words, not louder, worse, thinner. I heard him calling my name. Nora's hand paused against the bandage. "I tried the front doors. They were jammed or locked or swollen from heat. I know. I hit them with a rail until my hands split. I went around the side, broke a window. Smoke took me down before I got 10 feet inside. When I came to, men were holding me back and the roof was gone." The town said, "I'd left him in there," said we fought, said I was drunk, said a good brother. "We've got him out." Jack gave a short, humorless breath. Worst part was, I believed them, not the lies, but the heart of it. I was his brother. I get him out. Nora tied the clean bandage slowly. She knew the shape of this kind of pain. Not because she had lived his exact grief, but because she knew what it meant to have other people name your life until their words started sounding like your own thoughts. "When Maisie came for me yesterday," Jack said, "she was white as flour. Said a woman was being carried into the church, and nobody was stopping it. I didn't think of justice. Not first. I heard Daniel, same as that night, someone calling, and a room full of people standing close enough to hear. He looked at her then. I couldn't get him out. I could get you." Nora felt something inside her soften, but she did not offer him the easy comfort of saying he had saved her, and that made all things right. It did not. Nothing worked that way, so she said, "Thank you for coming before it was too late." His eyes lowered. Almost was, but it was tea outside. A loose shutter knocked against the cabin. The sound was small after the storm. Nora sat across from him on a crate. Her hands smelled of blood and lye soap. My father died when I was 9, she said. After that, my uncle Horace managed everything. Money, letters, visitors, decisions. He told me it was kindness, he said. Grief made women uncertain. Later he said youth made women uncertain. Then he said books made women too proud and silence made them respectable. Jack listened without interrupting. I was praised for being agreeable until agreement became expected of me before I even spoke. I learned to fold my hands, smile at the right time, lower my eyes when men discussed my future over dinner. She looked toward the lantern flame. They taught me obedience and called it virtue. Jack was quiet for a moment. Then he said, surviving may be the first honest thing you ever did for yourself. The words went deeper than Nora expected. She had been called foolish and improper, nervous, confused, and ungrateful. Honest was new. A chill crept back into the smokehouse as the coals dimmed. Jack reached for his coat, then stopped, looking at the blood on the lining. Instead, he took a folded wool coat from a peg and held it out to her. You reek cold, so are you. I'm used to it. That is not an argument. It's the only one I've got. Nora hesitated, then accepted the coat. It was too large and smelled faintly of smoke, leather, and wind. She wrapped it around her shoulders. Jack stood slowly this time, not pretending it did not hurt. At the door of the smokehouse, Nora paused. Jack, he looked back. I do not know what happened that night with your brother, but I know what I saw in the church. A guilty man does not ride into a room full of guns to give a stranger back her voice. For a moment he said nothing. His face did not change much, but something in his eyes did, something small and unguarded. Then he opened the door, and the cold night came in around them. Come on, he said quietly, before the fire dies out in the house. By the fourth morning after the storm, Jackass Well began to fail. At first, it was only a change in sound. The bucket did not splash when it struck bottom. It landed with a dull, muddy thud, and when Jack hauled it up, the rope came back heavier with sludge than water. He stood over the well for a long moment, one hand braced on the stone rim, his wounded shoulder stiff beneath his shirt. Nora watched from the cabin doorway, a coffee cup cooling between her hands, and knew by the set of his back that the trouble was worse than he wanted to say. He poured the bucket into the horse trough. The animals came forward eagerly, then lifted their heads in disappointment. Muddy water was still water, but not enough. Not for horses, not for men, not for a place already surrounded by enemies waiting for weakness to do their work for them. How long? Nora asked. Jack did not turn. If the well keeps dropping. 2 days before the horses start suffering. Maybe 3 if I ration. And after that I drive them north to Silver Spring. He finally looked at her. The morning sun cut sharp lines across his face to land Caleb claims he controls. Nora understood at once. Caleb did not have to send men with guns. He only had to wait until thirst pushed Jack across a line on a map. Then Jack would be called a trespasser, a thief, maybe worse. The trap was not sudden. It was slow and patient that made it crueler. Jack turned back to the well. He knows this land, knows the wells, knows which men are one dry week away from begging. Nora came down the steps. There must be another source. If there was, I'd have found it. The answer was not meant to insult her. It was simply the voice of a man who had lived years by reading ground, weather, animals, and hunger. But Nora thought of her father then, Thomas Whitaker, sitting at his old oak desk in St. Louis, bent over maps with a lamp burning low. He had once told her that water had a memory. It did not always show itself on the surface, but it remembered where it had been and where stone had forced it to go. Nora went back into the cabin without a word. Jack followed her to the doorway. Where are you going? To look at something? She pulled her carpet bag from beneath the cot. Jack had recovered it from Clara Finch's back room the night before, along with her letter of employment and a few clothes badly folded by hands that were not hers. At the bottom, wrapped in a linen handkerchief, was her father's map. She had carried it west out of duty more than understanding. A last piece of him she was not ready to leave behind. Now she spread it across Jack's table and smoothed the creases with both hands. Jack stepped closer. That the Silver Spring claim? Yes, but not only that. The map was old, drawn in brown ink with careful notations in her father's hand. Mercy Crossing was marked by a square. Silver Spring lay northwest, labeled clearly. But there were smaller marks too, faint lines and numbers that had once meant little to Nora. She leaned over them now, tracing with her finger. My father was a surveyor before he bought land, she said. He marked underground flow when he found signs of it. Jack frowned. Underground flow is guesswork unless a man digs. Not always. See this? She tapped a pale, wavering line that bent away from Silver Spring and ran southeast beneath a ridge. He drew this branch separately. He marked stone shelf here and here. Jack bent closer despite himself. That ridge is north of my pasture. Yes, there is no water there. There is no visible water there. He looked at her then, and she saw the argument in his eyes before he spoke it. Nora, that ground is hardpan and rock. I've ridden it 100 times. If I put a pick into the wrong place, I waste time we don't have. She folded her hands on the edge of the map. You risked your life because you believed I had the right to say no. Now believe me when I say I know how to read my father's map. That stopped him for a moment. The cabin was quiet, except for the restless shifting of horses outside. Jack looked at the map again, then at her. Nora picked up the pencil from the table and circled a place near the ridge. Here they started before noon. Jack brought the pick, 2 shovels, rope, and a short iron bar. Nora carried water, bandages, and the map tucked inside her bodice to keep the wind from taking it. The ridge looked even less promising up close. Dry grass clung to the slope in brittle patches. The earth was pale and cracked. Stone broke through in ugly teeth. Jack did not say I told you so. That, Nora decided, was one of his better qualities. He only handed her a shovel. Don't swing from the shoulders, you'll ruin yourself before supper. Use your legs. Let the tool do some of the work. You sound like a schoolmaster. Have buried enough fence posts to earn the position. They dug at first. There was only dust. It rose around them and stuck to sweat, turning Nora's face gritty and her hands raw. Jack worked slower than he wanted to. She could see that his shoulder had not healed, and each swing cost him. But he did not quit, and neither did she. By mid-afternoon, Nora's palms had blistered. By evening, one blister broke. She wrapped a strip of cloth around her hand and kept digging. Jack noticed. You can stop, so can you? That is different. Because you are a man? Because I'm used to being foolish? Then teach me properly this time. Jack smiled. Not much. Just enough to make his face look younger for one brief second. Near dusk, Silas Boone appeared over the rise with a mule, 2 canteens, and a sack of biscuits. He looked at the hole, then at Jack, then at Nora. Well, he said, either you two found something, or you've both gone touched in the head. Jack wiped dirt from his brow. Jury still out. Silas climbed down and picked up the second shovel. He did not ask permission. He simply began. They dug until the sky went purple. Nothing came but stone and dry earth. Nora felt disappointment pressing at the back of her throat, but she refused to let it speak. Jack called a stop only when it became too dark to see. They returned the next morning and then the next. On the third day, Maisie Bell came running across the field with bread wrapped in cloth and apples tucked into her apron pockets. She looked frightened to be so far from town, but proud too. Papa? I came, she said. Jack took the bundle then. You'd better get back before he learns. Maisie looked at Nora. Is it true you're finding water? We are trying, Nora said. The girl nodded solemnly. If trying were already a kind of truth, then hurried away. That afternoon, Jack struck the iron bar deep into a seam between the stones. The sound changed. Nora heard it before she understood it, not the dead ring of metal against dry rock, something duller, softer. Jack froze. Silas leaned on his shovel. Hit it again. Jack did. The bar came up dark at the tip. Nora dropped to her knees and pressed her hand into the loosened earth. It was cool. Not wet exactly, but cool enough to make her breath catch. They dug faster then, but carefully. The dirt grew darker. A thin line of moisture appeared beneath a flat stone. Jack drove the iron bar under the edge and pried. The stone shifted. Mud bubbled up from below. Not much, just a little. Then a narrow trickle slid into the hole. For a moment none of them moved. The water was brown and cloudy. It gathered slowly, barely enough to fill a cupped hand, but it was water, living water, water under a place everyone had called dry. Nora began to laugh. The sound surprised her. It came out tired, breathless, almost broken. Silas took off his hat and looked at the sky. Jack knelt beside the hole and put his hand into the mud. When he looked up at Nora, something had changed in his face. You were right, he said. Nora wiped her cheek, leaving a streak of dirt. My father was right. Jack shook his head. He drew it, didn't know what to say to that. They widened the hole enough to let the water collect, then lined the shallow basin with stone. It would need work. A lot of work. It would not save a town. It might not even save all of Jack's stock if the drought worsened, but it would buy time, and in that country, time could be the difference between keeping a life and losing one. At sunset, Jack filled a tin cup from the muddy seep and handed it to Nora first. She looked at it, then at him. You should drink your water. Our work, she said. He held her gaze for a long second, then nodded. She took one sip, tasting earth and iron and something like victory. Then she handed it back. Jack drank after her. Later, as they walked toward the cabin, he said, when we record this, it should go under your name. Came from your map. Nora looked toward the ridge, where the new water glimmered faintly in the fading light. "No," she said. "We found it together. Let it be written that way." Jack walked beside her in silence, but this silence was different from the ones before. It was not suspicion. It was not grief. It was the quiet of two people who had survived a hard thing by leaning, however carefully, toward each other. At the cabin, the horses drank from the first bucket drawn from the new seep. Nora stood with her bandaged hands folded against her waist and watched them lower their heads. Jack came to stand beside her. "You saved them," he said. Nora shook her head. "We saved them this time," he did not argue. The letter came on a Thursday, folded into the same mail pouch that brought flower orders, bank notices, seed catalogs, and a newspaper already 2 weeks old. Jack Calder did not go into Mercy Crossing for it. Silas Boone brought it out instead, tied to his saddle horn with a strip of twine, and dust gathered along every crease of his coat. He arrived near noon, when Nora Whitaker was kneeling beside the new seep with her sleeves rolled to her elbows, packing stones around the muddy basin so the water would not collapse the bank and swallow itself back into the earth. Jack was mending a broken trough not far away, working one-handed more than he admitted, his injured shoulders still stiff beneath his shirt. Silas climbed down from his mule with the slow care of a man whose bones had survived too many winters and one war. He took off his hat and looked at the little thread of water running between the stones. "Well," he said, "I'll be damned." Jack did not look up, likely, but not for that. Silas snorted, then held out the mail. "Finch girl's nephew carried this from town. Said it came in yesterday," and Voss clerk looked at it too long before letting it go. Nora wiped her hands on her apron and stood. There were 3 letters. One was addressed to Jack from the bank. He did not open it. The second was a supply notice. The third had Nora's name written across the front, in a hand she recognized so quickly that her breath caught. Miss Nora Ellen Whitaker. Louis handwriting. Careful, slanted, familiar. Her Aunt Margaret. For a moment the whole world seemed to narrow to that envelope. The dry ridge, the horses, the bucket, Jack hammer striking wood, even Silas watching with his bright old eyes, all of it moved away. Jack noticed, of course he did. "Bad news?" he asked. "I don't know yet." She did not open it in front of them. She could not. Something about the letter felt too much like a door, and Nora was not sure whether it opened toward rescue or another room where someone else would try to decide her life for her. She slipped it into her pocket and went back to the stones. Her fingers worked, but her mind was no longer with the water. All afternoon the letter sat against her hip like a coal. She felt it while she carried buckets. She felt it when she helped Jack lead the horses to drink. She felt it when Silas left and told them, without quite saying so, that town was whispering harder by the hour. Caleb Rusk had stopped smiling in public. Elias Voss had sent men to ask questions about Jack's debts. Reverend Bell had not preached on Sunday. Clara Finch had kept her store open, but looked as if she had not slept. Mercy Crossing was beginning to crack, and now St. Louis had reached out a hand. Nora waited until night to open the letter. Jack had gone to the barn to check the horses one last time, and the cabin was quiet except for the stove settling and the wind brushing dry grass against the walls. She sat at the table, broke the seal with her thumbnail, and unfolded the pages carefully. "My dearest Nora, if this letter reaches you, then you are still in Wooming, and I thank God for that, though I fear what keeping you there may cost." Nora read the sentence twice. Aunt Margaret wrote plainly, without the decorative phrases. Most women of her circle used to soften hard matters. Uncle Horace was under suspicion in St. Louis. 2 accounts from Nora Father's State had been found improperly managed. There were questions about land papers, missing correspondence, and money moved without Nora's knowledge. If Nora returned at once, Margaret believed she could help restore Nora's claim, protect what remained of her inheritance, and place her under no man's authority but her own. No forced marriage, no guardian, no uncle, no Caleb Rusk, a room in Margaret's home, a lawyer of her choosing, a chance to reclaim her life in a city where the streets had names she knew. Nora pressed her hand against the letter until the paper flattened under her palm. It was not a threat. It was not a trap. It was the first honest offer of safety she had received since stepping off the train. That should have made the decision simple. It did not. Jack came in a few minutes later, bringing cold air and the smell of horses with him. Nora folded the letter before he could see the writing. He noticed that too, but said nothing. He hung his hat on the peg, washed one hand at the basin, and moved carefully around the cabin, making small repairs to small things, because rest did not seem natural to him. For 2 days Nora carried the letter in silence. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. Then she told herself Jack had enough burdens. Then she told herself that nothing in the letter was settled yet, and there was no need to speak of possibilities, but each explanation felt thinner than the last. Jack did not press her. That was worse. He only watched in the way quiet men watched, without asking, without cornering, without letting himself be fooled. When she forgot to salt the beans, he ate them anyway. When she mended the same tear in her sleeve twice, he said nothing. When Maisie came by for a reading lesson, and Nora lost her place halfway through a primer, Jack stepped outside and gave them privacy, as if not seeing her confusion might preserve some dignity for her. On the second evening after Maisie had gone and the sunset had turned the ridge red, Jack found Nora standing near the well with the unopened bank letter in her hand. She was not reading it. She was simply holding something that belonged to him, because she did not know what to do with what belonged to her. He came to stand a few paces away. "You've been here all day," he said, "but some part of you has been packing." The words were so accurate that Nora closed her eyes. "I should have told you. Maybe?" She turned to him. "That is all you have to say?" "No." He leaned one hip against the well stones, his face unreadable in the fading light. "But I am trying not to say things just because I want them." That unsettled her more than accusation would have. She took the letter from her pocket and handed it to him. Jack did not reach for it right away. "You sure know?" He accepted it. Then Nora watched him read. She saw the muscles in his jaw shift once at the mention of St. Louis. His expression did not harden when he reached the part about Margaret's protection. He did not look betrayed. He did not look angry. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully along its original creases and handed it back. "She sounds like a good woman," he said. "She is, then you should think on it." Nora stared at him. "That is what you think. I think a person ought to walk through a door if it leads somewhere better. And if I left," he looked at the well, then toward the pasture where the horses moved like dark shapes against the grass, "then to make sure you got to the stage safe." After everything, his eyes returned to hers, especially after everything. The answer hurt. It hurt because it was kind. It hurt because he did not try to bind her with guilt, did not remind her that he had bled for her, did not turn his sacrifice into a debt she was expected to pay with her future. Nora's voice came out softer than she meant it to. "If I leave, will you think less of me?" "No, you would not think I was running?" Jack's mouth tightened, but not with judgment. "A door isn't freedom unless you are allowed to walk through it." For a moment Nora could not speak. All her life men had used protection as a bridle. Her uncle had protected her from worry by hiding accounts. Caleb had protected her from uncertainty by drugging her into silence. Voss had protected town order by turning fraud into paperwork. But Jack's version of protection had no cage in it. He was standing close enough to help and far enough away not to claim. That made the choice harder, not easier. Later that night, Nora read the letter again by lamplight. This time she read more slowly, not as a frightened woman offered rescue, but as a woman trained now to look for the words beneath the words. Near the bottom of the second page, she found the sentence she had missed. "If you remain absent from Yuming when the matter of Silver Spring is brought before a territorial court, Mr. Voss may attempt to argue that your interests require temporary male guardianship until your mental state and intentions are judged." I am told Caleb Rusk's name has already been suggested. Nora went cold. There it was. The door to safety had a shadow behind it. If she left now, she might save herself from Caleb's reach in body. But in law, on paper, in the language men like Voss understood, her absence would be turned against her. They would say she had fled because she was unstable. They would say she could not manage her property. They would say Caleb, as her wronged intended husband and prominent citizen of Mercy Crossing, should control Silver Spring until the court decided otherwise. And courts could take months. By then, the spring would be his in every way that mattered. Jack was outside splitting kindling when she came out with the letter in her hand. The moon was thin above the ridge. Each strike of the hatchet was controlled, almost gentle. Despite the strength behind it, "I missed something," she said. He stopped at once. She read the line aloud. Jack listened without moving. When she finished, he set the hatchet down. "You don't owe this town your life," he said. "No, you don't owe those ranchers water. You don't owe Belle forgiveness. You don't owe Clara understanding. You don't owe me staying, I know, but saying it was easier than believing it." Jack stepped closer, stopping at the edge of the lantern light. "Then go if you need to. We'll find another way." Nora looked toward the north, where Silver Spring lay unseen in the dark. Then she looked at the small seep they had uncovered together, the water catching a pale thread of moonlight between the stones. They set up a wedding because they thought my life could be arranged without me, she said. If I run now, they will set up a court and do the same thing with cleaner hands. Jack said nothing. Nora folded the letter and held it against her chest. I am tired of rooms where men discuss my future while I am absent. Something in his face changed, not surprise recognition. I will write to Aunt Margaret, Nora said. I will ask her to send whatever papers she can. But I am not leaving before the hearing. The hearing may not be fair then. I will be there to say so. They may come harder now. Let them. He studied her for a long moment. You are sure? No, she said. But I am certain. That almost made him smile. The wind moved between them. Nora could feel the fear waiting just beyond her ribs, but it no longer ruled the whole room of her body. Fear was present, so was anger, so was grief. And beneath all of it, something new and steady. Choice. Jack picked up his hatchet, then set it down again as if the wood could wait. Then we face them, he said. Nora looked at him. We? His answer came quietly. Only if you want the company. She held his gaze. And for the first time since the church, the future did not look like a door slamming shut. It looked like a road, hard, dangerous, uncertain, but open. Yes, she said. I want the company. Jack nodded once, as if she had given him something he would take great care not to misuse. Inside the cabin, the lamp burned low beside paper, ink, and the letter from St. Louis. Nora sat to write her reply. Not as a runaway bride, not as a frightened niece, not as a woman waiting to be rescued. She wrote as Nora Whiteacre. And she signed her name slowly, firmly, in full. 3 riders came just after noon, when the heat sat heavy over the ridge, and even the horses had stopped swishing their tails. Nora Whiteacre saw the dust first. It rose beyond the low pasture fence in a pale brown column, too steady to be wind, and too deliberate to be a wandering traveler. She was standing near the trough, rinsing mud from her hands after helping Jack strengthen the stones around the new seep. The water still came slowly, but it came. That alone had changed the feel of the place. The cabin no longer seemed like a dry piece of land waiting to fail. It seemed like something stubborn, something that had decided to live. Jack looked up from the fence rail he was shaving smooth with his knife. His expression did not change much. But the knife stopped moving. Inside, he said. Nora wiped her hands on her apron. No, he did not argue right away. That told her how serious he believed the moment was. His eyes stayed on the riders as they came closer, 3 dark shapes against the hard light. If that's Caleb, he'll want you standing in the open. Then he will not be disappointed. Jack turned toward her. Then, Nora, she heard the warning in his voice and something gentler under it. But she was tired of doors closing in front of her for her own good. She had been hidden, carried, drugged, dressed, and nearly married by people who kept saying they knew what was best. She would not meet danger from behind a curtain. I will stand on the porch, she said, not behind you. A faint muscle moved in Jack's jaw. Then he nodded once. Beside me then. They walked to the cabin together. Jack took his rifle from beside the door but did not raise it. Nora stood with one hand on the porch post. Her heart beat hard, but her feet held. The riders slowed at the fence. One was a hired gun. Nora could tell by the way he sat his horse loose and ready, one hand never far from his pistol. The second man wore a dark suit unsuited to the dust, with a leather satchel strapped behind his saddle, a lawyer, most likely. The third man removed his hat before the horse even stopped. For one moment Nora could not breathe. Horace Whittaker smiled at her with sorrowful eyes. My dear Nora. The sound of his voice pulled Louise into the Wyoming heat. Drawing rooms, heavy curtains, polished tables. Her uncle, standing by the mantel, telling her not to trouble herself with accounts, telling her grief made women vulnerable, telling her obedience was dignity. She gripped the porch. Post harder, Uncle Horace. He looked older than when she had left, though not weaker. His beard was neatly trimmed. His coat was dusty from travel but well made. He had always known how to look respectable. That had been his true talent. He dismounted with care and took one step toward the cabin. Jack's rifle shifted just enough to stop him. That's close enough, Jack said. Horace's eyes moved over Jack as if he were an unpleasant stain on a clean tablecloth. You must be Mr. Calder. I have heard a great deal about you likewise. The lawyer dismounted. Next, my name is Edwin Price. I represent Mr. LeBrusque in the matter of Miss Whitaker's broken engagement, an unlawful removal from Mercy Crossing. Nora laughed once. The sound surprised even her. Price frowned. Something amuse you, Miss Whittaker? The neatness of your words, she said. Unlawful removal sounds much tidier than escaping a forced wedding. Horace winced as if she had embarrassed him at dinner. Nora, this is exactly why I came. You are overwrought. You have been through a distressing ordeal, and I do not blame you for speaking rashly. You do not blame me, of course not. A woman under strain cannot always be expected to understand the consequences of her actions. Jack's hand tightened on the rifle. Nora raised her chin. I understood enough to say no. Horace glanced toward Price, then back at her with softened patience. Caleb is willing to forgive that unfortunate scene. He is a generous man. He understands that young women sometimes grow frightened before marriage. There is nothing generous about forgiving a woman for escaping a trap. The hired gun smiled at that, not kindly. Price opened his satchel and removed several folded papers tied with red string. Miss Whittaker, he said, you are required to appear at a territorial hearing in 3 days regarding the status of the Silver Spring claim, the validity of your engagement contract, and concerns about your present condition. My condition? Your judgment, Price said. Your stability, your capacity to manage property. There are witnesses prepared to testify that you arrived in Mercy Crossing in a state of confusion, fled a respectable marriage ceremony, and have since been living alone with an unmarried man of violent reputation. The words were chosen to wound in public, even though the only public here was dry grass, horses, and Jack called her standing still as stone. Nora felt heat rise in her face, but not shame. Not anymore. Jack took one step forward. You say another word about her that way. Nora touched his arm. He stopped. It was not much, just a hand against his sleeve, but she felt the force inside him, the anger waiting for permission. Caleb's men knew that anger existed. They had counted on it. They had come to make Jack Calder look exactly like the dangerous man Mercy Crossing already believed him to be. Nora kept her eyes on Price. If you have legal papers, leave them, Horace's voice softened again. Nora, please, come home with me. We can settle this quietly. Caleb will still marry you. Your name can be repaired. My name is not broken, it will be, Horace said, and for the first time the gentleness slipped. Do you think society forgives women who make spectacles of themselves? Do you think a school board will hire you after this? Do you think any decent family will take you in, once they hear you have been staying in this man's cabin? Nora stared at him. There it was. Not concern, not love, control, wearing the coat of family duty. How did Caleb know about Silver Spring? She asked. Horace blinked. Your father's investments were not secret. They were to me. You made certain of that. His mouth tightened. How did he know which train I took? How did he know I had answered the teaching letter? How did Voss get copies of my father's land claim? Nora, how much did they pay you? The question struck him harder than a slap for a heartbeat. No one moved. Even the hired gun stopped smiling. Jack looked from Nora to Horace, and she saw and understood settle in his face. Horace's silence answered. Nora felt something inside her give way, but it was not weakness. It was the last thread tying her to the belief that family could not sell what strangers wanted to steal. You gave them my name, she said quietly. My papers, my route, my trust. Horace recovered himself, but not fully. I did what was necessary to preserve your future. No, you sold my future and called it preservation. Price stepped in quickly. These accusations will not help you at the hearing. The hired gun leaned on his saddle horn and looked at Jack. Funny thing, Calder, you always do find yourself near trouble. First your brother in that barn, now this woman in a wedding dress. You like pretending you can save folks. Jack went very still. The gunman kept going. Or maybe you just like getting there too late. Nora felt the change in him. His grief rose before his anger did. His hand shifted toward the revolver at his hip. Nora turned and caught his wrist. Don't let them choose who you become, she said. Jack's breath came hard through his nose. His eyes stayed on the gunman for one long second, then his hand lowered. That small movement felt larger than a gunshot. Price placed the papers on the fence post. 3 days, Miss Whittaker. If you fail to appear, Mr. Rusk will petition for temporary guardianship over Silver Spring. Given your conduct, the court may find such a request reasonable. Horace put his hat back on. I pray you come to your senses before you lose what little mercy remains. Nora looked at him and felt the last of her fear turn into something clean. I lost my mercy for thieves in church clothes. Horace flinched, then he mounted. The 3 men rode away the way they had come, leaving dust and legal papers behind. For a while Nora and Jack stood without speaking. The new seep whispered softly near the ridge, patient and small, as if reminding them that hidden things could still rise. Nora walked to the fence post and picked up the papers. Her hands did not tremble. They set up a wedding once, she said. Now they are setting up a court. Jack came to stand beside her. Then this time, he said, we bring witnesses. Nora looked toward Mercy Crossing, invisible beyond the dry hills. 3 days, 1 hearing, a town full of frightened people. A banker with papers, a rancher with guns, an uncle who had sold her name and called it love. She folded the summons carefully. Then we had better start today. Maisie Bell came after dark, and she came alone. Nora Whiteacre heard the soft scrape at the cabin door while Jack Calder was cleaning his rifle at the table, slow and careful, as if every small motion helped him keep his thoughts in order. Outside, the night was windless, that made the sound sharper. Jack looked up at once, one hand already closing around the rifle before Nora could even rise from her chair. "Who is it?" he called. A small voice answered. "It's Maisie. Please don't shoot." Jack crossed the room and lifted the bar from the door. When he opened it, Maisie nearly stumbled inside. Her face was white beneath the dust, and her braid had come half undone. She looked as if she had run all the way from town, though Mercy Crossing sat miles beyond the dark pasture. Nora hurried to her. "Maisie, what happened?" The girl tried to answer, but breath failed her. Nora guided her to a chair and poured water into a tin cup. Maisie took it with both hands and drank too fast, coughing once before she could speak. "Papa kept them," she said. Jack shut the door and barred it again. "Kept what?" "The things from the wedding." Maisie looked at Nora, eyes wide and frightened. "The guest book. The paper Mr. Rusk wanted signed, the cup from Mrs. Finch tea. Papa put them in a tin box under the loose floorboard in the vestry. He said a coward, but he was not coward enough to burn the truth himself." The cabin went still. Nora felt the meaning of the words move through her slowly. Evidence, real evidence. Not rumor, not memory, not a young girl's frightened testimony standing against men with money. Something they could carry, should listen, something the fight might make a straight. Who else knows? Maisie swallowed. "Mr. Voss came to the church after supper. I was in the back room folding hymn sheets. I heard him tell Papa that old records have a way of confusing simple matters. Papa told him he had nothing. Mr. Voss said he hoped that was true, because fires start easy in dry weather." Nora looked at Jack. He was already reaching for his coat. They did not waste time. Jack saddled the horse while Nora wrapped Maisie in a blanket and told her to stay in the cabin with the door barred until they returned. Maisie begged to come, saying she knew the floorboard, knew the place exactly. But Jack cut his eyes toward Nora and shook his head. "No," Nora said softly. "You have already done the brave part. Let us do the dangerous one." Maisie's mouth trembled, but she nodded. Silas Boone met them near the South Trail, as if he had been expecting trouble before it had a name. Jack had sent word to him earlier that day, asking him to watch the town from a distance. The old veteran came out of the dark on his mule, with a shotgun across his lap and no surprise on his face. "Church?" he asked. "Church," Jack said. They rode hard, keeping away from the main road. Mercy Crossing should have been dark when they reached it. Instead, the sky above the town glowed orange. Nora saw the smoke first, then the flames. The church was burning. For one terrible second, no one moved. The little white building where Nora had nearly lost her name was now lit from within. Fire crawling up the rear wall, sparks rising into the black sky like a swarm of fireflies. The steeple bell hung silent above it, and the windows glowed red. Then someone screamed from inside. Jack was off the horse before Nora could catch his sleeve. Jack, he did not turn back. He ran across the yard toward the church doors, one arm lifted against the smoke already pouring through the cracks. Silas cursed and followed, but slower. Nora's heart slammed against her ribs. She saw again, as if memory belonged to her and not to him, the barn Jack had described his brother calling smoke, a locked door, a man arriving too late and spending years inside that single moment. Now Jack was running into fire again. Nora grabbed a water bucket from the pump beside the church steps, but the pump handle gave only a dry groan. She looked around wildly and saw the horse trough beside the hitching rail, half full. She dragged a blanket from Silas's saddle, plunged it into the water, and wrapped it around her shoulders. Silas caught her arm. "Don't be a fool, then don't let me be the only one." They moved to the side of the church where the smoke was thinner. The main doors burst open from within, and Jack appeared, dragging Reverend Bell under the arms. The old preacher was limp, his hair singed, his face blackened with soot. Jack pulled him down the steps and dropped to one knee, coughing hard enough to shake his whole body. Nora reached him. "Where is Maisie's box?" Jack tried to answer, but another sound came from inside, a childish cough. Not Maisie, another child. One of the younger boys from town, maybe the blacksmith's son. Then came a faint cry. Jack lifted his head. "No," Nora said, already knowing. He pushed himself up. "Jack, no, there's someone inside." He went back before she could stop him. This time Nora did not wait outside. She pressed the wet blanket over her mouth and ran for the side door. Silas came after her, swearing every step. The door to the vestry was jammed, but Silas swung the butt of his shotgun into the latch until the wood split. Smoke rolled out low and thick. Nora dropped to her knees, remembering something Doc Pike had once said: in town smoke rises, so a person who wants to live stays low. The heat struck her face like an open oven. Her eyes watered instantly. She crawled forward, one hand searching the floorboards, the other clutching the wet cloth to her mouth. Behind her, Silas shouted something she could not understand. Loose board. Maisie had said, loose board. Nora's fingers found a seam near the wall. She dug her nails into it. It did not move. She coughed, choking on smoke, and tried again. The board lifted just enough for her to wedge the edge of Jack's knife. Beneath, she pried hard. Pain shot through her wrist. The board came loose. Under it sat a small tin box. Nora seized it and shoved it beneath the blanket against her chest. A cracking sound split the air overhead. Silas grabbed the back of her dress and hauled her toward the door as burning plaster fell where she had been crouching. They stumbled into the yard together. Nora fell to her hands and knees, coughing until her throat tore. The tin box stayed under her arm. Jack came out moments later carrying a small boy against his chest. His coat was smoking. His face was nearly black with soot. He passed the child to Doc Pike, who had arrived with half the town behind him, and then Jack turned as if to go back once more. That was when the beam fell. It crashed through the front of the church, sending sparks high into the night. Jack disappeared beneath smoke and flammable dust. Nora screamed his name. Silas reached him first. Nora followed, though Doc Pike shouted for her to stay back. Together they found Jack pinned near the steps. One leg caught beneath a fallen timber. His eyes were open but unfocused. Blood ran down the side of his face where the old wound had reopened. Nora grabbed the timber with both hands. It burned her palms through the wet cloth. "Pull!" Silas shouted. They pulled. The wood shifted an inch, then another. Jack groaned, a sound Nora knew he would have swallowed if he could. Two men from town rushed forward at last, then a third. Together they lifted the beam enough for Silas to drag Jack free. He collapsed onto the dirt, coughing, shaking, alive. Nora dropped beside him. "Jack, look at me." His eyes found hers slowly. For a moment he did not seem to know where he was. Then his gaze sharpened the papers. He rasped, "Did we get them?" Nora held up the tin box, blackened but whole. Yes. Only then did he let his head fall back. By then half of Mercy Crossing stood in the churchyard. Some carried buckets, some only stared. Caleb Rusk stood near the bank across the street, dressed in his coat, his face lit by fire. Elias Voss was beside him, pale and still. Nora opened the tin box with burned fingers. Inside lay the guest book, the false marriage draft, and the blue china cup wrapped in cloth. Beneath them was one more paper, brittle with age. Silas took it, read it by firelight, and went very quiet. "What is it?" Nora asked. Silas looked at Jack, then at Caleb across the street. "A receipt," he said. "Payment to a ranch hand. Same night Daniel Calder died." Nora understood before anyone said more. The old fire, Jack's brother. The guilt Jack had carried for years. Caleb had been there too, hidden behind paper even then. Across the street, Caleb's eyes fixed on Jack, who was being lifted carefully by Doc Pike and two townsmen, his mouth twisted. "Some men," he said softly, "are hard to burn." But Nora heard him, and this time she was not the only one. The hearing was held in the town warehouse because the church still smelled of smoke. By morning, Mercy Crossing had gathered there in uneasy silence, standing between flour barrels, feed sacks, and rough wooden beams blackened by years of dust. It was not a holy place. There were no stained glass windows, no hymns, no polished pews. Maybe that was better. The last time Nora Whittaker had stood before the town in a sacred building, sacred words had nearly been used to steal her life. Jack Calder sat near the front, with his injured legs stretched stiffly before him, and his burned hands wrapped in clean cloth. Doc Pike had ordered him to stay in bed. Jack had ignored him. Nora stood beside him, not behind him, wearing the same brown dress she had worn to town before. Her palms were bandaged from the fire, but her back was straight. Caleb Rusk entered as if he owned the room. His coat was brushed clean, his boots polished, his face arranged into wounded patience. Elias Voss came behind him with a stack of papers tied in ribbon. Horace Whittaker sat at their table, looking less like a grieving uncle now, and more like a man watching a business deal go sour. The circuit judge, a gray-bearded man named Wilford Kane, called the matter to order. Caleb's lawyer rose first. He spoke of broken promises, female hysteria, damaged reputations, and Jack Calder's violent influence. He made Nora sound fragile, reckless, and ungrateful. He made Caleb sound merciful. He made the wedding sound like a misunderstanding. Nora listened without moving. Then Doc Pike was called. The old doctor stood with his hat in his hands and said plainly that the condition Nora described on the wedding day matched a woman dosed with laudanum or some other sedative. She could not have given lawful consent. When Caleb lawyer asked whether fear alone could make a woman confused, Doc Pike looked at him and said, "Fear can shake a woman. It does not put bitter medicine in her tea." A murmur passed through the room. Maisie Bell came next. Her voice trembled at first, but she did not stop. She told the judge she had seen Nora nearly unable to stand. She told him Caleb and Voss had gone into the vestry before the wedding. She told him Nora had tried to say no. Reverend Bell followed. Smoke had damaged his voice, so every word came rough, but every word landed. He admitted he had known something was wrong. He admitted Caleb pressured him. He admitted fear had made him keep reading when conscience told him to stop. Then Clara Finch stepped forward. She looked smaller than Nora remembered, her face pale and worn. She gripped the rail as if it were the only thing holding her up. "I gave Miss Whitaker the tea," Clara said. "Mr. Voss told me it would calm her nerves. He said if I refused, the bank would take my store." Voss's face hardened. Clara turned to Nora, tears shining in her eyes. "I told myself I had no choice." Nora looked at her for a long moment. The room seemed to wait for forgiveness or anger or something clean enough to make them all feel better. Finally, Nora said, "Fear is real, but so was what happened to me." No one spoke after that. Silas Boone brought out the burned tin box. From it came the guest book, the false marriage draft, the transfer papers, and the receipt found beneath them. Then Doc Pike helped an old former ranch hand to the front. The man was sick, bent, and shaking, but his words were clear enough. Years ago, Caleb had paid him to burn a barn and frighten Daniel Calder over gambling debts. He had not known Daniel was passed out inside. Caleb had let the town blame Jack. Jack did not move. His face went empty, as if the truth had struck too deep for pain to show at first. Caleb rose so fast his chair scraped the floor. "Lies," he said. All of it, but his voice had lost its smoothness. Nora stood then. "You tried to make me a wife without my consent," she said. "You tried to make this town call theft a marriage. You tried to make fear sound like law. But I am not property. I am not a signature you can copy. And I am not yours," Judge Kane declared the marriage invalid. Nora's right to manage Silver Spring was upheld. Caleb, Voss, and Horace would face investigation for fraud, coercion, forgery, and arson. As Caleb was taken away, he looked at Jack and said, "She'll leave you once she remembers what kind of man you are." Jack did not answer. Outside, after the hearing, Nora found him standing alone beside the warehouse wall, staring at nothing. "If I am not guilty," he said quietly, "I know what to do with all these years I spent punishing myself." Nora stood beside him. "Then Donna, throw them away," she said. "Use them to become gentle." Jack closed his eyes. For the first time since Nora had known him, he looked less like a man surviving punishment and more like a man learning how to live. Spring came slowly to Mercy Crossing, not like a promise shouted from the hills, but like something cautious returning after pain. Grass appeared first along the edges of the creek bed. Then small yellow flowers pushed through the burned ground beside the church. The old white building had not been fully rebuilt. One wall still carried smoke stains, and part of the roof was newer than the rest, the fresh boards pale against the weathered timber. Nora Whitaker liked it better that way. A perfect church might have pretended nothing had happened there. This one remembered. Caleb Rusk was gone, taken east under guard to answer for fraud, arson, and the old crime that had stolen Daniel Calder's life. Elias Voss Bank no longer ruled Mercy Crossing with quiet threats. Horace Whitaker had returned to Louis under the shadow of an investigation, carrying with him the last of Nora's childhood illusions. Not every wound had closed, not every apology had been spoken, but the town had changed in the way real places changed, slowly, unevenly, one honest act at a time. Nora opened her school in Clara Finch's old storage room while the schoolhouse roof was repaired. Every morning children sat at rough desks, scratching letters onto slates. Nora taught them arithmetic, spelling, geography, and something no primer had ever printed clearly enough. A name, she told them one morning, writing her own on the board, is not a thing you surrender lightly. Jack Calder heard about that lesson from Maisie Bell and said nothing for a long while. He only stood outside the schoolhouse that afternoon, hat in hand, watching Nora dismiss the children into the dusty sunlight. His limp was still there, worse in cold weather, and his burned hands would never be as smooth as they had been before. But he walked into town now without lowering his eyes. When people greeted him, he answered. When they apologized, he did not always forgive them at once. That, Nora thought, was also a kind of healing. One evening, Jack asked her to ride with him to the little branch of water they had found beneath the ridge. The place was green now, not lush, not grand, but alive. The trickle had widened into a shallow run lined with stones they had placed together. Jack stood beside it for a long time before speaking. I stopped a wedding once because it was wrong, he said. I want to ask for one now unless you can say no as freely as you can say yes. Nora looked at him, and if I say no, then I'll walk you home. Jack said, I'll mend the south fence tomorrow, and I'll be grateful you were free enough to answer me. That was when Nora knew her answer belonged to her. The wedding took place 2 weeks later, in the half-rebuilt church with the doors standing wide open. No one carried Nora inside. No one hurried her forward. No one spoke over her. She walked down the aisle in a simple blue dress sewn by the Women of Mercy Crossing, including Clara Finch, whose hands trembled as she stitched the hem. Jack waited at the front without a gun on his hip. He did not hide his limp. He did not try to look like a better man than he was. He came on honestly, and that was enough. Reverend Bell's voice shook when he asked, Nora Whittaker, do you come here of your own free will? Nora looked at Jack, then at the town that had once watched her silence and now waited for her voice. Yes, she said, because I am free to say it. Her vow was simple. The first time I stood in this church, my silence was used against me. Today I give you my voice freely. Not because you saved me, Jack called her, but because you never once asked me to belong to you before I belonged to myself. Jack's excitation, though no tear fell. I will walk beside you, he said. Not ahead of you, not above you, beside you for as long as you choose me. Years later, people would say Jack Calder rode half dead into a church and stopped a wedding. Nora always corrected them. He had not stopped a wedding. He had stopped a crime wearing a wedding veil. The real wedding came later, with open doors, honest witnesses, and a woman whose yes finally belonged to her. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.
The meaning of this story is not simply that a cowboy stopped a wedding. What Jack Calder stopped was something much darker. A crime dressed in white, a theft hidden behind vows, and a woman's silence being used as permission. Nora Whittaker's journey reminds us that no tradition, no law, no family name, and no public ceremony can make something right if it begins without consent. At the heart of this story is a simple truth. Every person has the right to choose their own life. Nora was treated like a document to be signed, a piece of land to be claimed, and a woman whose voice did not matter. But the moment she finally said no, her life began to return to her. That one word became more powerful than Caleb's money, Voss's papers, and the fear of an entire town. Jack's lesson is just as important. He did not save Nora, so she would belong to him. He risked his life so she could belong to herself. That is what makes his love honorable. True love does not trap, control, or demand repayment. True love protects freedom. It stands beside another person, not above them. The town of Mercy Crossing also teaches us something painful. Many people did wrong, not because they were evil, but because they were afraid. Yet fear does not erase responsibility. Silence can help injustice survive. A good heart means little if it never finds the courage to speak. In the end, this story is about healing, dignity, and human respect. The first wedding was built on lies, pressure, and stolen choice. The second wedding was built on truth, open doors, and a woman free enough to say yes. And that is the deepest lesson. No vow is sacred unless it is freely spoken, and no love is real unless it honors the freedom of another human being.